was listening to an old interview with Milton Friedman, you know, the famous economist Milton Friedman. And in the interview, he said something very interesting. He said it would be a miracle if rates did not rise. This was back in 2004, and that was at a time when rates at the time were historically low, 1%, the Fed funds rate. But I thought it was fascinating that he said it would be a miracle if rates didn't rise. Here's Milton Friedman, the great economist, who really kind of didn't understand the government as monopolist. It sets the price of its own money. It sets the interest rate. The Fed, right, the central bank, he didn't understand this. So he said it would be a miracle if rates did not rise. And then there was another thing that he said, which was just as fascinating, if not even more so. He said that what concerns him about government spending is, because it was a discussion about the deficit, and he said, well, he's not so worried about the deficit per se. He was more concerned about the level of government spending, because when the government spends, it takes away money from the private sector that people otherwise would have had. Now, this is the often heard, you know, loanable funds theory, which is totally, it does not apply in an economy where the country prints its own money basically, and where all of its debts are denominated in its own money. But let's go through the process. First of all, it's very important to understand that government spends first and taxes after. If you think about it, it's totally logical, because the only way for the citizens to have the money, in this case, in our case, the dollars, to pay their taxes, they have to be, those dollars have to be spent into the economy first. A good example of what I'm talking about is if you've ever played the game of Monopoly. Most people have played that game. Try playing that game without distributing the money first. I mean, you spin the dice, you go around the board, and let's say you land on community chest or chance, and it says pay tax of $75. You don't have the money. The game has to distribute the money first before you can even pay the tax. Same thing with the government. The government has to spend those dollars into the economy before you can even pay the tax. If the government did not spend the dollars into the economy first, and then it demanded taxes paid in dollars, how would you pay? You couldn't. So the government spends first and taxes later. So this notion of when the government spends, it takes away money. Now let's look at that. Let's assume that that's correct. Let's go on that sort of line of thinking, okay? And you know, we often hear people say, well, rich people are rich because they're the most productive. They work harder than people who are not rich. They're smarter, you know, all these things. So let's assume that the government, in order to spend, takes that money away, a lot of it from rich people, let's say, or we'll just call it more productive people who have more of that money, who get taxed. But then what happens? It turns around and it spends that money right back into the economy. So presumably, those very same people who were clever and innovative and productive and smart, who were able to capture that spending in the first place and, you know, build it into their own personal wealth, usually through the sale of goods and services or innovation. They create things, they sell it in the private economy. Those people are still going to be there. So even if it were true that the government, when it spends, it takes away that money, it turns right back around and spends it out. We have to assume that those very same productive, smart, innovative folks who captured that money in the first place, that made them wealthy, they're going to be there taking it back. So the argument falls apart. It has no validity whatsoever. But the truth is that the government spends first and taxes later. That's the only way it can work. You know, if it didn't spend first and the government said, okay, pay your tax. How do you pay the tax? If the tax is imposed in dollars, you can't. Okay, so it's scary when you think about it. Here's Milton Friedman. He got it wrong.